In terms of structure, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion up here. I'm going to give each of the panelists an opportunity to also introduce themselves briefly, maybe give us a little bit of a sense of how they're coming at this. And then, we'll have probably 30, 35 minutes or so in. We'll try to get you involved because I suspect that lots of opinions on this. In fact, I was approached during lunch by quite a few people who said they're keen to get in on this. So we're keen to get your perspectives on this. Very briefly, joining me for the discussion to my left are Agnes Kalibata, who is president of AGRA. To her left is Julius. We did actually practice his surname before the session, and I failed then. I'm going to give it a go, but let's see. Julius Kip'ngetich? No, I failed horribly. Anyway, I tried. He was Chief Operations Officer at Equity Bank here in Kenya, a name that will be very familiar to most of you. To my right is Gabriel Negat, who is a Regional Director at the African Development Bank. And last but not least, we have Edward Brown, who is Director of Policy Advisory Service at ACET, which is the African Center for Economic Transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. As I've outlined, and I'm going to ask the first question, I'm going to put the first question out there, and I'd like to get each panelist's thoughts on this, but also use this as an opportunity maybe to just give us a little bit of background in terms of how you're coming at this. And I'd like to start with you, Agnes. Is it a viable debate to be had in the context of where sub-Saharan Africa is today, or the continent is today, that we can have both inclusive and rapid growth? Now, we've seen rapid growth over the last decade or so. Inclusivity has been more of a challenge. Can the two realistically come together?
Thank you. Thank you for putting me on spot. When I was looking at the question, I was asking myself, so how else would we do rapid growth if it was not going to be inclusive growth? Now, when you look at the dynamics or what would I call it? The strata, when you look at how we are stratified on this continent, we still have 80%, in some cases 90% of our population locked up in agriculture, right? I'm coming at it from an agricultural perspective. Most of these people are outside the cash economy, and we are talking about rapid growth. Can we have rapid growth with 10% of the population, with 20% of the population? Would that be we want to see as growth? Now, by not investing in some of these areas that are more inclusive, like agriculture, we would be denying ourselves the opportunity to have a much faster, actually, I think that we would grow even faster if we invested in these areas that bring a whole lot of people on board. The agriculture sector has the opportunity to do that, to bring a whole set of people that have been locked out of the cash economy into the cash economy. And it's not that it's not doable. And I'll talk about what I know. I'll talk about Rwanda. Look at what Rwanda did in the last few years. Agriculture contributes 30% to the economy, the GDPs of most of these countries. By investing in agriculture, Rwanda was able to have about 6% consistent growth in that sector, which contributed to the overall 8% growth that was happening in the economy. So you had three sectors that were growing very fast. Excuse me. The industrial sector, the agricultural sector, and the services sector. So if you don't grow the agricultural sector, which is the one that you have, where you have the most people, you're definitely not doing a service to your country. The other problem is, if you do this rapid growth without engaging the majority of the people, you go back to undo certain things that you could have done well if you had done an inclusive development model. So I think that definitely in the agriculture sector, we like saying that agriculture contributes. When you invest in agriculture, you have an opportunity to get 3 to 4 times more growth, inclusive growth, than when you invest in other sectors. You get to contribute to a huge percentage of your GDP. You get to bring more people in the cash economy. You get to bring women on board. So you get to kill very many birds with the same stone. So yes, it's possible to do development, and very fast development, and have that as part of your rapid growth. Some economies have done that, and it's something that we hope that we can do.
Okay, thank you, Agnes. The agriculture sector obviously fundamental to this discussion, and in recent years has really come back into the mainstream of focus, not just on the policy side, but also on the investment side, in terms of really being key to unlocking a lot of Africa's economic potential. But we are going to get back to this because there is the follow-up question of how, and you know, I put you on the spot there, so I'm going to give you a bit of time to digest that and think about the how part. And in no particular order, I'd like to turn to you, Ed, and get your thoughts on this question of, is there some sort of trade-off here that we have to negotiate? Can African economies grow both rapidly and in an inclusive way, or is that really a little bit too much to ask at this point?
Thank you. No, I think that if you look at the current growth trajectory, Africa is growing very fast. You have to ask yourself, what is driving that growth? It's mainly commodity prices and the extractives. Now, this growth is jobless. Going forward, the issue is whether you can sustain high growth without inclusiveness. And I think it's not possible. You need to transform the economy, and by transforming the economy, you bring in the vulnerable groups, the other groups that have not been exposed to development. And transformation means that you need to look at the drivers, the key drivers of transformation. And here you have to look at diversification. If you diversify in your economy, you're becoming more robust, more resilient. You have to also think about increasing productivity in agriculture and in other sectors. If you look at Africa today, with the rapid growth of the economies, you still have a situation where only 10% of GDP is being contributed by the manufacturing sector. And this is the sector that is going to drive growth, because that's where you can have much more employment creation. Without the manufacturing sector, you would have serious challenges in creating jobs. Now, 10% value added to GDP, even this has been the same since the 1970s. Now, if you look at the countries that we benchmark our country, Africa with, say, for example, Brazil, Chile, Malaysia, South Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam, these countries about 30 years ago were at the same level as we are. But today, they are being classified as either upper middle or even higher middle income countries. Because if you look at the economies, they've been highly diversified. Diversification of production, and here, if you look at the percentage of GDP that is contributed by manufacturing, is very important. The other element of inclusiveness is that you need to develop the capacity to be more competitive. Export competitiveness implies that you are benchmarking yourself with the best, and therefore you are increasing efficiency and productivity in the various sectors of the economy. You are crowding the formal sector, moving away from informality to formality. And as you move from informality to formality, you're broadening the tax base, increasing the revenue to the state, and therefore the state can then have the fiscal space to be able to do those kinds of things that are necessary to even increase inclusiveness.
Thank you very much, Ed. Now, the key point there on the need for transformation, which has really been sort of a very pronounced characteristic of Africa's growth trajectory over the last 10 years. High GDP figures, but economies not really diversifying, not really structurally being transformed. And on that note, I'd like to turn to you, Gabriel, because the issue of structural transformation is one that is very core to what the African Development Bank, the role of the African Development Bank in addressing this question of, hey, how can we have both inclusive and rapid growth? So your thoughts on this question of, are the two compatible?
Yeah, thank you very much. You know, one can cogently argue on both sides of this thesis, the yes and the no. That would just perhaps complicate things more than we'd like to.
It would make them more interesting.
Yeah,
so
but,
if you want to take a no position,
yeah.
please do.
Well, you know, let me frame it this way. You know, the issue of growth in Africa is no longer a new story. I mean, I think growth is passé now. Everybody is going by 5, 6, 7 double-digit growth. So it's not enough to grow nowadays. I think we are now getting to the point where we are interrogating quality of growth. Okay, we're looking at the source of growth, the drivers of growth, and talked about the source of growth, the color of growth. Is it brown? Is it green? The gender of growth, is it inclusive? So, growth sort of presented in the aggregate has become no longer interesting. But in this process, some inequalities will be inevitable. That's just a fact of life. Because you can have rapid growth that is not inclusive, but you cannot have inclusivity without growth. So you will only being inclusive in poverty. So growth is a necessary precondition, whereas the inclusivity is something that one needs to plan for, in the short term. And I think experience it across almost in any country we look at. In the short term, growth takes precedence. And then with the right type of policy intervention and so on, the inclusivity part comes in. The challenge here is how well do you take care of those that are not embraced in that growth in the initial years? If the tide is not rising all the boats, how well do you take care of those that are marginalized, disadvantaged, and so on? I think even when you interrogate inclusivity, sort of peel off what it means, it's all about some will be left behind, invariably, in the short term. Now, how well do you take care of them until the system picks up? So I'll leave it at this and then hopefully come back.
No, it's slightly more complex description there. Growth takes precedence, and some degree of inequality is inevitable, which is not necessarily what we want to hear, but it is backed up by historical experience and by what we're witnessing on the. That's something that we'll get back to. Julius, turning to you last, Equity Bank in many ways is sort of it's the holy grail, right, in terms of inclusive and rapid growth. One of the statistics that is often put out there in terms of Africa is just how much of the population is still unbanked. And because people, there's so many poor people, you can't sell them financial services. Now, Equity Bank really stands out in that it has demonstrated that not only can one address the bottom of the pyramid, but it can be done at scale. So I'm assuming you're going to say, yes, the two go hand in hand, but it would be great to get your thoughts and perhaps a little bit of a sense of where a company like Equity Bank is coming from.
Okay, thank you very much. Listening to this debate, you get the feeling that we can make the assumption that we can grow Africa by excluding others. The answer is no. Development is about people, economics is about people, and if African countries want to grow, it has to grow with the entire population. The 1 billion of us must grow. And it's a question of how do you design the model that brings everybody on board. And the first thing that should happen is that governments must design economic policies that brings people on board, as many as possible. And if you look at, I'll give you a little story about equity, but before that, is that Kenya government and many other economies in East Africa have been influenced by equity itself in designing policies that bring in excluded populations on board. For example, if you look at, say, Equity Bank, initially it was not profitable, but it was tolerated by government because then it was bringing people on board. So we need a regulator, a central bank that can tolerate those who want to bring people on board. And then that regulator must be innovative enough to then design policies that bring in the excluded, the poor, into the net. And in East Africa, for example, with the exclusion of Uganda, Central banks have registered agents, people who are shopkeepers, but they become bank agents. Many of them in Africa are excluded because then access is not seen as a principle of bringing people on board. So for example, Equity Bank has 15,000 agents in East Africa. And that is about extending the footprint of the bank without having a fixed cost. Because the agent is a variable cost. That has allowed the bank to then minimize its footprint. Okay, we have almost 220 branches now, but 15,000 agents. Because the branch is a fixed cost, but we're able to extend banking services to those who are excluded by using a variable model. So it's how your regulators become innovative, and central banks have come to look at equity from Africa, and the greatest challenge is, how do you trust somebody else to do banking services? Of course, you have to trust your people, because then there is a mutual benefit between the bank and the agent, because the agent gets paid for the transactions. As we speak today, the 15,000 agents do more transactions than the branches and our ATMs combined. Why? Is because then there is a mutual benefit. We call it in equity shared prosperity. There is a mutual benefit between us, our agent gets the transaction fee, and our customer gets to lower their cost of accessing financial services. So the triangle shares the prosperity. So the first thing I would say is that government must then be willing to embrace new ideas on inclusivity. If that doesn't happen, you go nowhere. And we have seen countries where they delay this and the level of inclusion drops dramatically. If you look at, say, Rwanda equity entered 2 years ago. Okay, we now have 800 agents, but only supported by 10 branches. In the process, in terms of customer numbers, we became #1 in 2 years. We now have close to 500,000 customers who bank with us. The total number of customers in East Africa is 9.8 million as of yesterday. And how did we bring in 9.8 million? Is because of the design of the policies of government, which then enables an institution to be innovative to bring in as many people as possible. In 2007, in Kenya, a similar thing happened with mobile banking, where the government allowed Safaricom and other mobile operators to bring in as many people as possible. A product which I'm sure most of you are aware called M-Pesa. So M-Pesa was just an SMS, just a notification. Yes?
Heard of M-Pesa? No?
I'm sure they are aware.
Okay,
so,
good.
As we speak today, M-Pesa has 27 million. Out of a population of 43, there are 27 who transact on M-Pesa. That's very, very high, almost 70% inclusion. And many countries have resisted M-Pesa type of transactions because then they don't understand it and they think it leads to high velocity of money. No, M-Pesa is just an SMS. The money still sits in the banking system, but you allow them to lower the cost of production. So just sending an SMS, you have an agent on the other end, and the banks then have come along to see how they can support an M-Pesa type of transaction. So equity is a very good example of what is possible when government cooperates. Then the bank itself is very efficient. The level of efficiency of
last point for now.
Yes.
Okay.
The level of efficiency of Equity Bank is 3 times the industry average. If you look at, say, cashiers, a cashier in Equity is 3 efficient than the bank in the why? Because he owns the company. We are the only bank in the country where employees don't belong to a union. Why? Because they own it. Because through the employee share ownership plan. So we are an efficient bank. We are the 4th most efficient bank in the world. We are very strong in technology. We have the right business model and the right business product design.
We're going to have to move on. We're going to have to move on. Anybody who wants to invest in Equity Bank, come see Julius afterwards, okay?
I'll tell you more. Thanks.
Now, so the consensus seems to be so far that the answer kind of is, well, you can't really have rapid growth if it's not inclusive, which brings us to the next step of this debate, which is the question, well, okay, how do we do this? And having had a bit of time, Agnes, I'd like to turn back to you. The World Bank tells us that the agriculture dollars in the hands of hedge funds and foreign companies investing into land, but that, as we know, the vast majority of smallholder farmers, or the many smallholder farmers,